Jake White Eagle stopped mid-stride on the forest path, his radio crackling to static in his trembling hand. Four massive wolves sat in perfect formation around a weathered granite headstone, their golden eyes reflecting the dying sunlight like ancient guardians keeping an eternal vigil. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Wild wolves don't mourn human graves. The largest wolf, a magnificent male with silver-streaked fur, lifted his head and released a mournful howl that echoed through Wind River Valley. The others joined in perfect harmony, their voices carrying a grief so profound that Jake felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks before he realized he was crying. Eleanor Crow. Feather had been dead for exactly 6 months today, yet these wolves had never left her side. The woman who'd spent her final years invisible to the world had somehow earned the most loyal family imaginable, one that refused to abandon her even in death. Jake keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Dispatch, I need backup at Crow Feather Cemetery, and someone get me Marcus Standing Bear." What debt could 4 wild wolves possibly owe to an old woman's grave? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 2 years earlier, Eleanor Crow Feather had believed she was living her final chapter alone. At 70, the Cherokee Irish woman sat at her kitchen table each morning, methodically setting 2 plates for breakfast before remembering Harold wouldn't be coming down the stairs ever again. The cancer had taken him 3 years ago, along with their life savings and her reason to wake up each day. Now she rationed heart medication like wartime supplies, choosing between pills and groceries on her fixed income of $1,200 a month. The cabin that had once echoed with Harold's laughter and their daughter Jessica's childhood giggles now held only the tick of an old clock and Eleanor's conversations with Harold's photograph. Jessica called once a month from Seattle, asking dutifully about medications but never about dreams, loneliness, or the way Eleanor sometimes forgot to eat for days. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Eleanor would lie, watching raccoons raid her garbage while she ate beans and rice for the 4th consecutive night. Her nearest neighbor was Marcus Standing Bear, a man consumed by his own darkness. The 43-year-old Lakota had moved to Wyoming after military service, accepting a position as wildlife control officer that required him to eliminate problem animals. His weathered hands, steady from years of military precision, now tracked wolves with the same intensity he'd once reserved for enemy combatants. Marcus lived for his 8-year-old son Tommy, whose face bore 3 jagged scars from a wolf attack 18 months prior, permanent reminders of the moment Marcus had failed as a protector. The boy's mother, Sarah, had left after the attack, her final words echoing in the empty house. "You were supposed to keep him safe." Now Marcus worked 18-hour days hunting wolves, believing each kill brought Tommy one step closer to safety. But the child rarely spoke anymore, communicating primarily through obsessive drawings of wolves that covered every surface of their modest home. Jake White Eagle served as the bridge between these fractured lives. The 35-year-old Crow Nation Park ranger had grown up calling Eleanor grandmother, though they shared no blood relation. She'd delivered him during a blizzard when the reservation doctor couldn't reach his mother, and he'd been checking on her welfare ever since Harold's death. Jake understood both the federal wildlife regulations he was sworn to enforce and the tribal customs that viewed wolves as sacred relatives, leaving him constantly torn between law and tradition. Eleanor's daily routine had become a meditation on survival. Each morning she walked the old trap line from her ranching days with Harold, checking for injured animals and removing snares left by careless hunters. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same woman who'd once trapped predators to protect livestock now spent her final years undoing that damage. Her arthritic hands, still steady from decades of veterinary practice, carried wire cutters and antiseptic, prepared for whatever suffering she might discover in the Wyoming wilderness. On this particular September morning, the suffering she found would change 4 lives forever. The whimpering reached Eleanor's ears before dawn had fully broken over Wind River Valley. She'd been walking her usual route along the old trap line, wire cutters heavy in her coat pocket, when the sound stopped her cold. It wasn't the sharp cry of a rabbit or the chittering of an injured squirrel. This was deeper, more primal, carrying a note of desperation that made her chest tighten with recognition. Following the sound through morning mist that clung to the pine trees like grief, Eleanor discovered the source of the anguish. 4 wolf cubs, no more than 10 weeks old, were caught in steel leg-hold traps that she recognized with a sickening lurch of her stomach. The rusted metal bore the distinctive markings she and Harold had stamped into their traps 20 years ago, back when they'd run cattle on this land and viewed predators as enemies to be eliminated. The largest cub, a male with distinctive dark markings around his eyes, had been struggling so long that his right front paw was swollen and bleeding. He bared tiny teeth at Eleanor's approach but couldn't muster the energy to do more than whimper. Beside him, a female with alert amber eyes watched Eleanor with the kind of intelligence that made her feel judged by something ancient and wise. The third cub, another male, had managed to chew through part of the trap's chain, but remained tethered by twisted metal that had cut deep into his leg. But it was the smallest cub that broke Eleanor's heart completely. The little female had been caught for so long that infection had set into her left eye, the tissue swollen and discolored beyond saving. She lay on her side, barely conscious, breathing in shallow pants that reminded Eleanor of Harold's final days in the hospital. "Oh, dear God," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt in the damp earth. "What kind of legacy did we leave?" Her veterinary training kicked in despite the trembling in her hands. Moving slowly to avoid startling the terrified cubs, she examined each injury with professional thoroughness. The largest male would recover with proper care. The alert female had only superficial wounds. The third male needed stitches but would heal. But the smallest female... Eleanor gently lifted the cub's damaged head, seeing clearly that the eye was beyond salvation. The irony cut deeper than any scalpel. These cubs were likely the offspring of the very wolves she and Harold had tried to eliminate decades ago. Their traps, forgotten and abandoned when they'd sold their cattle, and Eleanor had focused on her veterinary practice, had been lying in wait like metal predators, ready to inflict suffering on the innocent. Working with methodical precision despite her racing heart, Eleanor began the delicate process of freeing each cub. The largest male required the most careful work. The trap had to be pried open while Eleanor held his leg steady to prevent further damage. He growled weakly, but seemed to understand she was helping, his amber eyes never leaving her face. The second cub, the alert female, actually licked Eleanor's hand when freed, as if thanking her for the kindness. The third male tried to bolt the moment he was released, but collapsed after 3 steps, his injured leg unable to bear weight. Eleanor caught him gently, whispering Cherokee words her grandmother had taught her, ancient sounds that seemed to calm the frightened animal. But the smallest female, the one with the ruined eye, presented the greatest challenge. The infection had spread, and Eleanor knew from 45 years of veterinary experience that without immediate surgical intervention, the cub would die within days. The decision that followed would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could call Jake and turn the cubs over to wildlife services where bureaucracy and budget constraints might doom them to euthanasia, or she could take them home and attempt treatment herself. Looking at the 4 helpless creatures, Eleanor saw not predators or problems, but babies who'd been orphaned by circumstances beyond their control. She thought of her own loneliness, the empty cabin where she talked to Harold's photograph, the silence that had become her constant companion. These cubs needed a mother figure, and God knew she needed something to live for beyond counting pills and stretching grocery money. "All right, little ones," she murmured, pulling horse blankets from her truck. "Let's go home." The journey back to her cabin became a careful procession of pain and hope. Eleanor carried 2 cubs at a time, their small bodies warm against her chest, their heartbeats rapid with fear and trauma. She set up a recovery area in Harold's old workshop, using veterinary supplies she'd kept from her practice days. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of whimpering filled the space where Harold had once built birdhouses and repaired farm equipment. As she cleaned wounds and administered antibiotics with expired but still effective medication from her supplies, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death: purpose. These 4 cubs needed her, and for the first time in 3 years, someone, something, depended on her for survival. 3 weeks after Eleanor brought the cubs home, Marcus Standing Bear crouched beside a fresh kill site at the Henderson Ranch, his jaw clenched as he examined the evidence. A yearling calf lay gutted in the morning frost, its throat torn with the precision that marked wolf predation. The tracks in the soft earth told a story that made his blood run cold. Multiple wolves, working in coordination, growing bolder with each successful hunt. "That's the 3rd one this month," Jim Henderson said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "I'm losing more cattle to wolves than I did to drought last year. When's the state going to do something about this problem?" Marcus photographed the carcass from multiple angles, his military training evident in the methodical documentation. Each image would become part of his report to the Wildlife Commission, building the case for expanded hunting permits and increased elimination quotas. But as he worked, his mind kept drifting to Tommy, whose nightmares had returned with a vengeance after news of the recent attack spread through their small community. The boy had been drawing again, obsessive sketches that covered every surface of their kitchen table. But something had changed in the artwork. Where once Tommy drew wolves as monsters with slavering jaws and blood-red eyes, his recent pictures showed wolves that looked almost protective, smaller wolves being cared for by larger ones, packs working together not to hunt, but to nurture their young. "Dad," Tommy had whispered the previous night, after another screaming nightmare had jolted them both awake. "In my dreams, the wolves aren't trying to hurt anyone anymore. They're just trying to protect their babies." Marcus had dismissed it as therapeutic progress, but the words echoed in his mind as he tracked the pack responsible for the Henderson kill. The trail led northeast toward the reservation boundary, where federal jurisdiction became murky and tribal customs complicated his authority to act. Specifically, the tracks pointed toward Eleanor Crow Feather's property. That evening, Marcus knocked on Jake White Eagle's door, his face grim with purpose. Jake answered wearing civilian clothes, but Marcus could see the tension in his friend's shoulders. The ranger had been expecting this conversation. "We need to talk about Eleanor," Marcus said without preamble, accepting Jake's silent invitation to enter the modest house. "What about her?" Jake's tone was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the protective edge underneath. "The pack that killed Henderson's calf passed right by her property. Hell, the tracks practically circle her cabin before heading back into the forest. Either she's the unluckiest woman in Wyoming or something's drawing them there." Jake poured coffee with deliberate slowness, buying time to choose his words. "Eleanor's been feeding wildlife since Harold died. Raccoons, possums, the occasional deer. Maybe that's attracting the wolves." "Raccoons don't leave tracks the size of dinner plates," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone to show Jake the photographs. "We're talking about a pack of at least 4 wolves, probably juveniles based on the paw size, but big enough to take down livestock. They're establishing territory, Jake, and Eleanor's place seems to be the center of it." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jake had suspected Eleanor was hiding something ever since he'd noticed her increased grocery bills. Specifically, her sudden need for bulk meat purchases that made no sense for a woman living alone on a fixed income. But suspicion and proof were different animals entirely. "You think she's harboring wolves?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. I think she found something she shouldn't have kept, and now it's grown into something dangerous. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the urgent whisper he'd used during military briefings. Those aren't wild wolves anymore, Jake. They're habituated to human contact, which makes them unpredictable. And with Tommy's history, the unspoken fear filled the room. Marcus couldn't risk another attack on his son, but he also couldn't officially investigate Eleanor without probable cause that would hold up in federal court. The reservation's complex jurisdiction meant any action against Eleanor would require tribal approval, state wildlife authorization, and federal oversight, a bureaucratic nightmare that could take weeks to navigate. Give me 48 hours, Jake said finally. Let me talk to her first. If she's hiding something, I'll handle it through proper channels. But Marcus was already shaking his head. My son's safety isn't subject to bureaucratic timelines. Those wolves are getting bolder and winter's coming. When prey gets scarce, they'll start looking at easier targets. Easier targets like what? Like school children waiting for buses, like old women living alone in cabins. Marcus stood, his hand unconsciously moving to the service weapon at his hip. I've got legal authority to investigate predator activity on federal land adjacent to the reservation. Eleanor's property borders national forest, which gives me jurisdiction if I have reasonable suspicion of wildlife violations. The threat was clear, even wrapped in legal terminology. Marcus would act with or without tribal cooperation if he felt Tommy was in danger. Jake found himself caught between his duty to protect federal wildlife and his loyalty to the woman who'd been like a grandmother to him his entire life. That night, Jake drove to Eleanor's cabin under cover of darkness, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was about to shatter whatever fragile peace she'd found since Harold's death. The old woman answered his knock wearing Harold's oversized bathrobe, her silver hair braided for sleep, and Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worried vigils. "Jake, honey, what brings you out so late?" "We need to talk, grandmother," he said, using the Cherokee term of respect that always made her smile. But tonight, Eleanor's expression grew guarded, as if she'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. Behind her, from somewhere deeper in the cabin, came a sound that confirmed Marcus's worst fears, the unmistakable whine of a large canine, followed by the soft thump of heavy paws moving across wooden floors. The confrontation came on a December evening when the first blizzard of winter trapped everyone in Wind River Valley like pieces on a chessboard. Marcus Standing Bear had spent 3 days tracking the wolf pack through fresh snow, following a trail of kills that led inexorably to Eleanor Crow Feather's property. His tactical gear weighed heavy on his shoulders as he approached her cabin, night vision scope mounted on his rifle, backup weapon secured at his hip. Eleanor stood on her front porch despite the driving snow, her frail figure backlit by the warm glow of her living room. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, watching Marcus's investigation close in like a noose. Behind her, 4 massive shapes moved in the shadows, no longer the helpless cubs she'd rescued months ago, but full-grown wolves whose amber eyes reflected the porch light like golden coins. "I know they're in there, Eleanor," Marcus called out, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. 4 wolves, juveniles that have been killing livestock throughout the valley. You're harboring dangerous predators." "They're not predators," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the bitter cold. "They're my family." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus felt his finger tighten on the rifle's trigger as the largest wolf, the male he'd been tracking for months, stepped into view beside Eleanor. The animal stood nearly as tall as the old woman's waist, his silver-streaked coat magnificent in the artificial light, his intelligent eyes fixed on Marcus with unsettling directness. "Step away from them, Eleanor. These aren't pets. They're wild animals that pose a clear and present danger to the community." But Eleanor moved closer to the wolf instead, her weathered hand resting on his massive head with casual familiarity. Alpha has never hurt a soul. None of them have. They protect this property, they hunt wild game, and they've given an old woman a reason to live again. Jake White Eagle's patrol vehicle appeared through the swirling snow, his emergency lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue shadows. He stepped out wearing full ranger gear, his own weapon drawn but pointed toward the ground, trying to position himself as mediator rather than combatant. "Marcus, let's talk about this," Jake shouted over the storm. "Eleanor, please get inside where it's safe." "I'm not leaving them," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions in veterinary practice. "I won't let anyone hurt my children." The standoff intensified when headlights approached from the opposite direction. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized his own truck. Tommy had followed him despite explicit instructions to stay home with the neighbors. The 8-year-old boy climbed out of the passenger seat, his small figure almost swallowed by his oversized winter coat, his scarred face pale in the harsh light. "Dad, what are you doing?" Tommy called out, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. "Get back in the truck, Tommy. Now!" Marcus's command was sharp with panic, but the boy ignored him, walking steadily toward the cabin where 4 wolves now stood fully visible on the porch. The largest wolf, Alpha, took a step forward, and Marcus raised his rifle. "Don't move, or I'll shoot." But Tommy continued walking, his small boots crunching through the snow, until he stood directly between his father's weapon and the wolf pack. The boy's scarred face was turned up toward Alpha, showing no fear as he extended his hand toward the massive animal. "Hello," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the scene. "I know you. You're the one from my dreams." Alpha lowered his great head and gently sniffed Tommy's outstretched hand. The wolf's tail wagged once, a gesture so domestic and peaceful that Marcus felt his worldview crack like ice under pressure. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, his son face to face with the predators that had scarred him. But instead of attack, instead of violence, Tommy was smiling for the first time since the original attack 18 months ago. "They're not the bad wolves, Dad," Tommy said, his small hand now resting on Alpha's massive head. "These are the hurt ones. Like me." The second wolf, Luna, approached Tommy with careful steps, her amber eyes fixed on the boy's scarred face. She sniffed delicately at his cheek, then gently licked the old wounds with a tenderness that made Eleanor weep openly. Scout joined them next, his curiosity evident as he investigated this small human who showed no fear. Finally, Shadow limped forward, her missing eye socket healed but still visible, and she pressed her head against Tommy's chest as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, his rifle wavering as he watched his traumatized son interact with wolves as if they were beloved pets. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of months of guilt and love. "The wolves that attacked Tommy weren't these wolves, Marcus. These 4 were babies when that happened, trapped and dying in steel jaws that my own hands had set 20 years ago. They know what it means to be hurt, to be helpless, to need someone to save them." Jake moved closer, his weapon now holstered, his role shifting from law enforcement to witness. "Marcus, look at your son. Really look at him." Tommy was laughing, the first genuine laughter Marcus had heard from the boy since the attack. The child was surrounded by 4 massive wolves, but instead of cowering in terror, he was gently scratching behind Shadow's ears, telling her in whispers that her scars made her beautiful, that being different didn't mean being broken. "The therapy isn't working because Tommy doesn't need to overcome his fear of wolves," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm. "He needs to understand that some wolves are dangerous, but others are just trying to survive. Just like some people are cruel, but others are kind." These four have never killed livestock, Marcus. They hunt deer and elk in the forest, just like their ancestors did. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis as the implications hit him. Then who's been killing the cattle? An older pack from the Northern Territory, Jake answered, pulling out his tablet to show tracking data. We confirmed it yesterday through DNA analysis of the saliva samples. The pack you've been hunting lives in the forest and avoids human contact. Eleanor's wolves have never left this property except to hunt wild game. The revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow. He'd spent months pursuing innocent animals while the real predators roamed free in the Northern Territory. His obsession with Eleanor's wolves had been built on false assumptions and misdirected fear, while his son had been suffering from trauma that had nothing to do with the gentle giants now surrounding him with protective affection. Eleanor suddenly swayed on her feet, her face pale in the porch light. The stress of the confrontation, combined with months of skipping heart medication to buy food for the wolves, had finally taken its toll. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the familiar squeeze that meant her heart was struggling to maintain its rhythm. "Eleanor!" Jake lunged forward as the old woman collapsed, her frail body crumpling onto the wooden porch. Marcus found himself running toward the woman he'd come to confront, his rifle forgotten in the snow, his military medical training overriding everything else. He dropped to his knees beside Eleanor, checking her pulse while Jake called for emergency medical services that wouldn't be able to reach them through the blizzard for hours. The four wolves formed a protective circle around Eleanor's unconscious form, their massive bodies shielding her from the wind and snow. Alpha lay down beside her, sharing his body heat, while Luna positioned herself to block the worst of the storm. Scout and Shadow maintained watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for threats that might harm their vulnerable pack leader. Tommy knelt beside Shadow, his small hand resting on the wolf's neck. "Is she going to be okay, Dad?" Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the traumatized victim he'd been protecting all these months, but a resilient child capable of love and forgiveness that humbled his father's hardened heart. The wolves weren't threats to be eliminated. They were Eleanor's family, and now, somehow, they'd become part of Tommy's healing process too. "I don't know, son," Marcus admitted, continuing CPR compressions on Eleanor's fragile chest. "But we're going to do everything we can to help her." As the blizzard raged around them, 3 humans and 4 wolves maintained vigil over the woman who'd taught them all that family isn't defined by species, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for those you love. Eleanor Crow. Feather died at 11:23 p.m. on December 15th, her final breath escaping in a whisper that sounded remarkably like Harold's name. The blizzard that had trapped them all in her cabin seemed to pause in that moment, as if the very wind was paying respects to a woman who'd spent her last months choosing love over fear, sacrifice over safety. Marcus knelt beside her still form, his hands that had come prepared to kill now trembling as they checked for a pulse that would never return. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd arrived as an executioner and found himself serving as witness to the most profound act of grace he'd ever encountered. The wolves she'd died protecting now formed a perfect circle around her body, their massive heads lowered in what could only be described as mourning. "She's gone," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking on the words. The admission felt like sacrilege in the warm cabin where Eleanor's love still seemed to pulse in every handmade quilt, every carefully arranged photograph, every bowl that had fed wild creatures with the tenderness of a mother. Tommy, who had barely known Eleanor but felt her loss like a physical wound, knelt beside Shadow and wrapped his small arms around the one-eyed wolf's neck. "She's not really gone," he said, with the certainty that only children possess when confronting the incomprehensible. "She's just taking care of the wolves from somewhere we can't see." Jake coordinated the necessary calls through his radio. Tribal authorities, medical examiner, funeral arrangements that would need to wait until the storm passed. But even as he spoke the required words, handled the mandatory procedures, his heart was breaking for the woman who'd been grandmother to him in everything but blood. Eleanor had delivered him into this world during another blizzard 35 years ago, and now she was leaving it in the same way, surrounded by those who loved her, refusing to abandon her responsibilities even in death. The four wolves maintained their vigil throughout the night, refusing food, water, or comfort. They seemed to understand that their protector was gone, their pack leader lost to something they couldn't fight or heal. Alpha pressed his massive body against Eleanor's side, sharing warmth with someone who would never feel cold again. Luna positioned herself by Eleanor's head, occasionally nuzzling the silver hair with a gentleness that made grown men weep. Marcus found himself changed by the night's events in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The man who'd come to destroy Eleanor's wolf family now understood that he'd stumbled into something sacred, a bond that transcended species, logic, and every assumption he'd held about the relationship between predator and prey. Watching Tommy sleep peacefully between Scout and Shadow, he realized his son had been trying to teach him something he'd been too afraid to learn. "What happens to them now?" Tommy asked, when morning finally broke gray and cold through the cabin windows. The question hung in the air like the storm that was finally beginning to subside. Legally, the wolves should be relocated or eliminated. They were habituated to human contact, potentially dangerous, certainly unfit for release into the wild. But as Marcus watched them maintain their protective formation around Eleanor's body, he knew that legal definitions meant nothing in the face of love this profound. Jake made the first difficult decision. We honor her wishes. She wanted them to have a chance at freedom. "They won't survive," Marcus said, though his conviction was wavering. "They don't know how to be wild." But even as he spoke, Marcus was watching Alpha demonstrate remarkable intelligence, organizing his siblings into hunting formations when they finally ventured outside to relieve themselves. These weren't domestic animals pretending to be wild. They were wolves who'd learned to trust humans without losing their essential nature. The medical examiner arrived as the storm cleared, confirming what they all knew. Eleanor Crow Feather had died of massive cardiac arrest, her heart simply too worn out to continue. But what the official report couldn't capture was the expression of peace on her face, the slight smile that suggested she'd departed knowing her work was complete. As Eleanor's body was prepared for transport to the tribal funeral home, the four wolves gathered at the cabin's front door. Without prompting, without coercion, they began walking toward the forest. At the tree line, they stopped and turned back once, their golden eyes reflecting the morning sun like a final salute to the woman who'd saved them. Then they disappeared into the wilderness, carrying Eleanor's love into the wild places where it would echo for generations yet to be born. 6 months after Eleanor's death, Jake White Eagle stood in the empty cabin that had become a shrine to impossible love. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that Eleanor would never again peer through to check on her wolves. The tribal council had asked him to clear the property for demolition, but Jake couldn't bring himself to disturb the carefully preserved evidence of Eleanor's final months. It was while searching through Harold's old workshop that Jake discovered the root cellar hidden beneath a trap door, covered by decades of accumulated tools and forgotten farm equipment. The wooden ladder creaked under his weight as he descended into the earth, his flashlight beam revealing a space that Harold had obviously used for storage during their ranching years. But what Eleanor had kept there defied all logic and shattered Jake's understanding of the past 6 months. Stacked on rough wooden shelves were detailed journals in Eleanor's precise handwriting, documenting every day of her life with the wolves. But as Jake read through the entries, a disturbing timeline emerged that made his hands shake with disbelief. According to the medical examiner's official report, Eleanor Crow Feather had died at 11:23 p.m. on December 15th during the blizzard confrontation with Marcus. Yet the journals contained entries dated weeks and months after her documented death. March 3rd. Alpha brought a deer today, shared with the pack in the meadow behind the cabin. I'm so proud of how well they hunt together now. April 15th. Shadow's injured paw is healing nicely. She still favors it when the weather changes, but she runs with her siblings through the forest like her disability doesn't exist. Such strength in that little girl. May 20th. Marcus visited again today with Tommy. The boy is thriving, drawing pictures of wolves as protectors instead of monsters. Sometimes the greatest healing comes from the most unexpected places. Jake's flashlight trembled as he continued reading, finding entry after entry that detailed Eleanor caring for the wolves, receiving visitors, and maintaining her daily routines long after her death certificate had been filed with the county. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, the same careful script she'd used to document animal treatments during her veterinary career. He emerged from the root cellar with an armful of journals and drove directly to Marcus Standing Bear's house, where he found his friend teaching Tommy how to repair wolf-damaged fencing, work they now did voluntarily to help their four-legged neighbors rather than to keep them out. "Marcus, we need to talk," Jake said, spreading the journals across the kitchen table where Tommy's wolf drawings still covered every available surface. Marcus read the entries with growing confusion, his weathered face pale in the afternoon light filtering through kitchen windows. "This is impossible, Jake. I was there when she died. I performed CPR myself." The medical examiner confirmed it. "Then explain these," Jake said, opening another journal to reveal detailed sketches of the wolves' daily activities, growth measurements, and behavioral observations that continued month after month beyond Eleanor's death date. Tommy looked up from his homework, his scarred face serious beyond his 8 years. "Grandfather Jake, are you saying Wolf grandmother is still taking care of her babies?" The innocence of the question hit both men like a physical blow. Tommy had been calling Eleanor Wolf grandmother since the night she died, insisting to anyone who would listen that she visited the wolves every day to make sure they were healthy and happy. Marcus had assumed it was his son's way of processing grief, but now— "Marcus," Jake said slowly, "when did you last see Eleanor?" 2 weeks ago, Marcus replied automatically, then stopped, his face going white. "That's impossible. She's been dead for 6 months. But even as he said it, Marcus could clearly remember the encounter. He'd been checking the Wolfpack's territory with Tommy when they'd spotted Eleanor sitting on her porch, gently brushing burrs from Shadow's coat. She'd waved at them, called out that Shadow had gotten into some blackberry bushes, and reminded Tommy to bring his latest wolf drawings to show her soon. Jake pulled out his phone and began making calls, starting with the tribal council members who'd reported seeing Eleanor in recent weeks. One by one they confirmed impossible sightings: Eleanor feeding her wolves, tending her garden, hanging laundry on lines that had been empty since her death. The hardware store owner insisted she'd purchased wolf food just last week, paying with cash and asking about Tommy's progress in school. The medical examiner's records were unambiguous. Eleanor Crow Feather had suffered massive cardiac arrest during the December blizzard and been pronounced dead at the scene. Her body had been transported to the tribal funeral home, where traditional Cherokee death rites had been performed. She'd been buried in the Wind River Cemetery in a ceremony attended by over 100 community members. Yet 17 different people had reported seeing her alive and well in the months following her funeral. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Tommy's therapist, provided the most disturbing testimony when Jake contacted her office. "Tommy has been telling me for months that Eleanor visits the wolves every day. He draws pictures of her spirit form, says she appears translucent but still interacts with the animals." I assumed it was part of his healing process, but his descriptions are remarkably consistent and detailed. Jake drove to the cemetery as sunset painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor's grave sat beneath an old cottonwood tree, the headstone reading, "Beloved wife, mother, and healer." But what he found there defied every rational explanation his scientific mind could construct. 4 adult wolves lay in a perfect circle around the grave, their massive bodies positioned like compass points. They'd been there so long that the grass beneath them had died, creating permanent indentations in the earth. Local residents reported that the wolves maintained this vigil every single day, leaving only to hunt before returning to their posts beside Eleanor's headstone. As Jake approached, the largest wolf, Alpha, raised his great head and looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The wolf's expression was calm, almost expectant, as if he'd been waiting for Jake to discover the truth that the pack had known all along. "She's still with you, isn't she?" Jake whispered, kneeling beside the grave. Alpha's tail wagged once, a gesture so human-like in its communication that Jake felt tears streaming down his cheeks. The other wolves, Luna, Scout, and Shadow, remained in their positions, but acknowledged Jake's presence with soft whines that sounded remarkably like mourning songs. Jake pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "Bring Tommy to the cemetery, now." When they arrived 20 minutes later, Tommy immediately ran to Shadow, kneeling beside the one-eyed wolf and wrapping his small arms around her neck. "She's here, Dad. Wolf grandmother is here with her babies." Marcus looked around the empty cemetery, seeing nothing but headstones and gathering darkness. But Tommy was pointing to a spot directly beside Eleanor's grave, his face lit with joy as he appeared to be listening to someone speak. "She says Alpha has been protecting the territory from the bad wolves," Tommy reported, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use when relaying conversations with imaginary friends. "And Luna had 2 puppies last month, but they're safe in the den in the forest. And Scout found a hurt deer and helped it instead of hunting it because Wolf grandmother taught him that some animals need healing, not hunting." Jake felt the hair on his arms rise as Tommy continued relaying information that no 8-year-old could possibly know. Details about wolf behavior, territorial boundaries, and pack dynamics that would require years of professional observation to understand. "What else does she say, Tommy?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tommy listened intently to something only he could hear, then smiled with the innocence that only children possess when confronted with miracles. "She says love doesn't end just because someone's body stops working. And she says her job isn't finished yet because her babies still need their mom." As if responding to an unheard signal, all 4 wolves stood simultaneously and began walking toward the forest. But instead of disappearing into the darkness, they stopped at the tree line and turned back, their golden eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight as they waited. Tommy stood and took his father's hand. "She wants us to follow. There's something important she needs to show us." Marcus looked at Jake, both men understanding that they stood at the threshold of something that would forever change their understanding of love, loss, and the bonds that transcend death itself. 1 year after Eleanor Crowfeather's death, the Wind River Valley had transformed into something neither Jake White Eagle nor Marcus Standing Bear could have imagined during those dark December days, when an old woman's heart had stopped beating in a Wyoming blizzard. The morning of Eleanor's death anniversary dawned clear and cold, with crystalline air that carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of wolves singing their ancient songs to the rising sun. Jake arrived at the cemetery first, carrying a wreath of sweetgrass braided according to Cherokee tradition. He'd spent the previous evening with tribal elders, learning the proper ceremonies for honoring ancestors whose spirits refused to rest. The elders had listened to his impossible story, with the grave attention reserved for sacred mysteries, nodding as if supernatural guardianship was as natural as seasonal migration. "Some souls are too strong for death," Elder Joseph Crow Dog had explained, his weathered hands weaving grass with practiced precision. When love runs deeper than blood, deeper than breath, it creates bonds that outlast the body. Your Eleanor became something more than human when she chose those wolf cubs over her own safety. Marcus arrived with Tommy, both dressed in their finest clothes out of respect for the woman who'd taught them that family meant more than shared DNA. Tommy carried a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked that morning, along with his latest drawing, a portrait of Eleanor surrounded by 4 adult wolves and their cubs, all bathed in golden light that seemed to emanate from the old woman's gentle smile. The wolves were already there, of course. They'd maintained their vigil every single day for exactly 1 year, leaving only to hunt and tend their young before returning to their positions around Eleanor's grave. But today, something was different. Today, they'd brought their children. 6 wolf cubs, ranging in age from 3 to 8 months, played among the headstones with the fearless exuberance of youth. They tumbled over each other, chased butterflies, and explored the cemetery with curious noses while their parents watched with protective alertness. The sight of new life flourishing in a place dedicated to death struck all 3 human visitors as profoundly meaningful. "Look, Dad," Tommy whispered, pointing to Shadow, who was gently correcting one of her cubs with a soft nip to the ear. "She's teaching them how to be respectful in sacred places." Marcus knelt beside his son, marveling at how the boy who'd once screamed himself awake from wolf nightmares now served as translator between species. Tommy's therapy sessions had evolved into something unprecedented, a child teaching adults about interspecies communication while healing his own trauma through connection with the very animals that had once terrified him. Doctor. The Martinez had documented Tommy's progress in a case study that was attracting attention from child psychologists across the country. Traditional therapy assumes recovery means overcoming fear, she'd written. But Tommy's healing came through understanding that fear and love can coexist, that the creatures we perceive as threats might actually be fellow survivors seeking the same thing we are: safety, family, belonging. Jake placed the sweetgrass wreath on Eleanor's headstone, speaking the Cherokee words for honoring ancestors whose work continues beyond death. As he chanted, the adult wolves formed their familiar circle, but the cubs settled into a smaller circle within their parents' protection, as if they too understood the solemnity of the moment. "Eleanor Crow Feather," Jake said in English, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery, "your legacy lives in 4 grown wolves who've never forgotten kindness, in 6 cubs who'll grow up knowing humans can be protectors instead of predators, in a boy whose scars taught him empathy, and in a father who learned that true strength comes from choosing love over vengeance." Marcus stepped forward, his hand resting on Tommy's shoulder. "I came here a year ago to kill your family," he said to the headstone, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so focused on protecting my son from danger that I couldn't see the real threat was my own hatred. You saved more than 4 wolf cubs, Eleanor. You saved my soul." The ceremony was interrupted by the arrival of a caravan of vehicles, tribal council members, wildlife biologists, documentary filmmakers, and visitors from as far away as Yellowstone National Park. Word of the wolf pack's unprecedented loyalty had spread through social media and scientific journals, drawing people who needed to witness proof that love transcends the boundaries humans create between species. But it was Sarah Standing Bear's arrival that shocked Marcus most profoundly. His ex-wife stepped out of a rental car with hesitant uncertainty, her eyes immediately finding Tommy among the wolves. She'd driven from Denver after seeing a video of her son playing with wolf cubs, the child's laughter so pure and healing that she'd realized her own fear had kept her from the family she desperately missed. "Tommy?" Sarah called softly, her voice breaking on their son's name. The boy looked up from where he'd been showing one of the cubs how to be gentle with the wildflowers. His scarred face lit up with joy so radiant that several visitors began crying spontaneously. He ran to his mother with the fearless determination he'd learned from wolves who face life's challenges with courage born of pack loyalty. "Mom, you came to meet Wolf Grandmother," Tommy exclaimed, wrapping his arms around Sarah's waist. "She's been waiting to meet you. She says families that are broken can heal, just like hurt animals can heal if someone loves them enough." Sarah looked around the cemetery, seeing only headstones and gathered people. But Tommy was already pulling her toward Eleanor's grave, where the wolves waited with patient dignity. "I don't see anyone, baby," she whispered. "That's okay," Tommy replied with the wisdom of a child who'd learned to see beyond surface appearances. "She says some people need time to understand that love never really dies. But she's here, Mom. She's always here when her family needs her." As the day progressed, something remarkable happened. The gathered crowd, scientists, tribal members, tourists, and skeptics, began sharing stories of Eleanor's impact. The hardware store owner described her post-death purchases of wolf food. The postal worker recounted delivering mail to a woman who'd been buried 6 months earlier. The tribal health services nurse testified that Eleanor had called to check on Tommy's vaccination schedule just last week. Dr. Robert Chen, a wildlife biologist from the University of Wyoming, had come to document the pack's behavior for academic research. But as he interviewed witness after witness, his scientific skepticism transformed into something resembling religious awe. "I've studied wolf behavior for 20 years, he told the assembled crowd. "Pack loyalty typically extends only to living members. What's happening here challenges everything we understand about animal consciousness and emotional complexity." Tommy tugged on Dr. Chen's sleeve. "Wolf Grandmother says you're asking the wrong questions," the boy announced matter-of-factly. "She says instead of wondering how wolves can love someone who's dead, you should ask why humans think death can kill love." As sunset painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, the official ceremony transitioned into something more intimate. The crowds dispersed, leaving only Jake, Marcus, Tommy, and Sarah standing beside Eleanor's grave as the wolves prepared for their evening hunt. But before departing for the forest, Alpha approached the headstone with something in his mouth. The massive wolf gently placed a small bundle at the base of Eleanor's grave, a carefully woven nest containing a single wolf cub, no more than a few days old. The tiny creature was clearly premature, likely abandoned by its mother, and without immediate care, it would die before morning. Tommy knelt beside the fragile bundle, his expert hands, trained by months of watching Eleanor care for injured animals, gently lifting the newborn. "She's asking us to continue her work," he said, looking up at the adults with Eleanor's own determination shining in his young eyes. "This baby needs a family, just like Alpha and Luna and Scout and Shadow did." Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look that carried a year's worth of pain, healing, and possibility. Their son held a dying wolf cub with the gentle confidence of someone who'd learned that love requires courage, that healing demands sacrifice, and that families are built through choice rather than chance. "What do you think, Tommy?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Are you ready to help us save another life?" Tommy's smile was pure Eleanor, wise, determined, and filled with the unshakable faith that love always finds a way to continue, even when death tries to end the story. Sometimes the greatest families aren't born, they're chosen. At 70, Eleanor Crow Feather discovered that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens into something more powerful than we ever imagined. When she rescued 4 orphaned wolf cubs from her own forgotten traps, she thought she was saving them. Instead, they saved her from the crushing loneliness that follows losing a spouse, watching children move away, and feeling invisible in a world that seems to forget we exist. Eleanor's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. While society sees retirement as an ending, Eleanor found her greatest purpose in her final years, becoming the mother figure these cubs desperately needed. Her legacy lives on through creatures who understood that true family means showing up every single day, never giving up on those you love, and protecting each other against all odds. The wolves still guard Eleanor's grave, teaching us that the bonds we create through unconditional love transcend even death. In a world where nursing homes overflow with forgotten seniors, Eleanor's tale proves that our capacity to nurture, heal, and transform lives only grows stronger with wisdom. What unexpected family has brought meaning to your golden years? Have you ever discovered that saving someone else actually saved you? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today. October brought a deceptive calm to Wind River Valley, the kind of peace that precedes storms. Eleanor had fallen into a rhythm with her 4 growing charges, though each day brought new challenges that tested both her failing health and dwindling finances. The cubs had grown from helpless babies into adolescent wolves, weighing nearly 60 pounds each, their wild instincts sharpening even as their loyalty to Eleanor deepened. Alpha had assumed natural leadership of his siblings, positioning himself between Eleanor and any perceived threat. His intelligence was remarkable. He seemed to understand that Eleanor needed protection more than she needed protecting others. When her chest pains struck during their morning walks, Alpha would gently press against her legs, forcing her to sit and rest until the episode passed. Luna had become the pack's sentinel, her amber eyes constantly scanning for danger. She'd learned to recognize the sound of Jake's patrol vehicle from a quarter-mile away, alerting the others with a soft whine that sent them scrambling for cover in Harold's workshop. Scout lived up to his name by ranging farther from the cabin each day, bringing back increasingly sophisticated intelligence about human activity in their territory. But it was Shadow who worried Eleanor most. The little female had adapted remarkably well to her monocular vision, but her attachment to Eleanor bordered on the obsessive. She refused to hunt with her siblings, instead staying close to Eleanor's side, somehow sensing the old woman's declining health with an accuracy that unnerved her. "You know, don't you, little girl?" Eleanor whispered one evening as Shadow lay pressed against her chair, the wolf's remaining eye fixed on Eleanor's face with unsettling intensity. "You can smell it on me, the sickness Harold had." Eleanor had been rationing her heart medication for 2 months, choosing between pills and meat for the wolves. The chest pains came more frequently now, accompanied by dizziness that forced her to grip furniture to stay upright. She'd stopped answering Jake's calls, afraid he'd hear the weakness in her voice and insist on a doctor's visit she couldn't afford. The financial reality was stark. Her Social Security barely covered utilities and property taxes, leaving nothing for the specialized diet 4 growing wolves required. She'd sold Harold's tools, their wedding rings, even his prized fishing equipment, to buy meat. The local butcher had started extending credit when he noticed the elderly woman purchasing exclusively scraps and organ meat, nutrition fit for carnivores but economically priced for someone counting every dollar. Marcus Standing Bear was closing in, and Eleanor knew it. His investigation had become methodical, professional, deadly in its precision. Trail cameras appeared along the forest paths the wolves used for hunting. GPS tracking devices marked trees near her property. Most ominously, Marcus had begun interviewing neighbors about unusual animal activity, working his way systematically toward her cabin. Jake tried to warn her during his increasingly frequent visits, but Eleanor deflected his concerns with the practiced skill of someone who'd spent decades hiding symptoms from worried families. Just the usual raccoons and possums, she'd insist, while four massive shapes moved like shadows in Harold's workshop. The transformation in the wolves troubled her as much as it amazed her. They were no longer the helpless cubs she'd rescued. They were apex predators, capable of bringing down elk and defending territory with lethal efficiency. Yet they remained gentle with her, allowing her to check their teeth, clean their ears, even administer medication when Scout returned limping from an encounter with a porcupine. Tommy Running Wolf's therapy sessions provided the only bright spot in Eleanor's darkening world. Jake had mentioned the boy's remarkable progress, how his wolf drawings had evolved from nightmarish monsters to protective guardians. The child spoke of dreams where wolves and humans lived in harmony, where scars became symbols of survival rather than shame. Maybe that boy understands something the rest of us have forgotten, Eleanor told Alpha one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Maybe fear and love don't have to be opposites. Alpha's response was a gentle nuzzle against her hand, his massive head resting on her lap with trust so complete it brought tears to her eyes. Here was a creature that should flee from human contact, instead choosing to comfort an old woman whose heart was giving out one beat at a time. Winter was coming, and Eleanor knew she faced an impossible choice. The wolves needed to return to the wild before the first serious snow, but releasing them meant exposing them to Marcus's elimination program. Keeping them meant risking discovery, arrest, and the certain death of creatures who'd become more family than pets. As November's first frost painted the cabin windows with ice crystals, Eleanor felt time running out like sand through her arthritic fingers.